Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper Moment number 86. The mission of our Digging Deeper Moments is to take God's Word to God's world. We're so glad that you've joined us. Last week, we saw that it was a man named Nimrod who led the people in Genesis 11 to rebel against God and build the Tower of Babel. The question we want to answer tonight is, what was so bad about this tower that God felt it necessary to intervene in this situation by confusing the languages of the people and scattering them throughout the earth? The answer is a very simple one. The people were turned to the idolatrous system of worship that had caused all the problems in the world before the flood of Noah that we read about in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Last week we saw that when speaking of Nimrod, Moses uses the word mighty 2 times. And the Hebrew word for mighty is Gibor. And it's used to describe Nimrod, and it's the same word used in Genesis 6:4 to speak of the Nephilim. It says they were giants, this is Genesis 6:4, there were giants on the earth in those days. And then afterwards, and when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men, Gibor, mighty men who were of old, men of renown. What Moses seems to be doing here is connecting the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 with that of the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 4. In our study of the Nephilim and Digging Deeper Moments, number 77 through 82, we saw that there are 3 possible ways to interpret this word Nephilim. That they were giants born of the marriage between fallen angels and human women, that they were the godly line of Seth who married the ungodly line of Cain, or they were the famous tyrants, kings of old, who were deified. This last interpretation, that they were tyrant kings of old, seems to fit what's happening here in Genesis chapter 10 and 11 the best. We say this because when Moses talks of the tyrant kings in Genesis 6:4, he adds the statement that they were men of renown. And last week we saw that Nimrod was also a mighty man of renown. Now, while we can't prove that Nimrod is reinstating the pre-flood idolatrous worship system when he built the Tower of Babel, we can say with certainty that at the least in the building of the Tower of Babel, he was creating an idolatrous worship system, and this is the idolatrous worship system we find through the ancient world. You may remember that the Tower of Babel was something called a ziggurat, with a shrine or a bedroom for the god at the top of it, and that the stairs were made for the god to come down, not for people to go up. You may also recall that on the ceiling of these shrines or these rooms were the constellations. Now, it's my belief that the original 12 constellations were given to Adam or one of his sons, perhaps Seth or Enoch or one of his descendants, and they actually declared the gospel of Christ. I covered this in last year's Christmas series in a sermon called God's Poem. This is found on our website for December 13th, 2020, and so you can check that out if you like. But I stated in that sermon that the original message of the constellations got corrupted and turned into astrology by those who lived before the flood. And so here we are, just a short time after the flood, in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Now we're just a short time past that, maybe 150 years. It depends on whose dating method you use, but it's not a very long time. And the people are rebuilding this idolatrous system of worship all over again in defiance and rebellion towards God. Now, in the system of worship before the flood, the Nephilim were deified. They became men of renown, which means they were deified as gods. Their exploits were recorded, and they became deified. And because there was no writing back then, their exploits were depicted in the constellations, and the gospel story found in the constellations was all but lost. It stands to reason that Nimrod, as a mighty one, is doing the same thing, except that instead of deifying and worshiping the men of old, the heroes of old, he's deifying himself. And we say this for at least 2 reasons. First, in antiquity, Nimrod became known as the father of the gods. And so the religious system that develops, he's the father of the gods. All the other gods will come out from who he is. Secondly, we know that after God confused the languages in Genesis chapter 11 and scattered the people, that they went throughout all the earth and they took this idolatrous system of worship wherever they went. And so what we find is that in the ancient world, they worship the same gods in the same way, except in the different countries, their names are different, but they're the same gods. And so what we find is that Nimrod, who's the father of the gods, he became known throughout the nations by different names like Jupiter, Baal, Hermes, Vulcan, Nebo, Bel, Janus, Bacchus, Kronos, Saturn, Osiris, Tammuz, and many others. And his wife, Semiramis, who's also known as the mother of the gods, She too became known throughout all the nations of the earth under different names, such as Astarte, Asherah, Venus, Re, Isis. That's just to name a few. But the connection doesn't stop there. The original story of the constellations got hijacked, at least in my opinion, they got hijacked. Some people believe that the constellations were not originally depicting the gospel. That's for people to choose for themselves. But either way, the constellations were used to depict the exploits of Nimrod. Let me give you a couple examples. The constellation Sagittarius is a centaur, which is half man and half horse with a bow and arrow in his hands. Now, according to Ken Fleming in his book, God's Voice in the Stars, this constellation originally spoke of the coming seed of the woman, Christ, who would bruise the head of the serpent and have his heel bruised in the process. God promises this in Genesis chapter 3:15, which speaks of the incarnation and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Being a centaur speaks of Christ's two natures, as God and as man, and the bow and arrow speak of his conquering the devil. Now, at the Tower of Babel, this all got changed, or if you don't believe that the gospel was originally in the stars, and we don't want to get dogmatic about that, then this system got started or restarted, where the story of Nimrod, who according to Alexander Hislop, in his book, The Two Babylons, according to him, Nimrod domesticated the horse and used it to become a mighty hunter in the earth. And that being able to use horses gave him an advantage. So he became a mighty man in the earth. And so Sagittarius is half horse and half man with a bow and arrow in his hand. So this speaks of Nimrod, who domesticated the horse and used it to hunt with his bow and arrow and to become a mighty hunter. Now, it's possible that these constellations did originate before the flood, and that knowledge was carried on the ark with Noah and his sons, and then it was polluted by Nimrod at the Tower of Babel. You'll have to decide that for yourself. But either way, whether this system got started at the Tower of Babel or whether it's a carryover from before the flood, the meanings of the constellations which were painted on the ceilings of these shrines at the top of the ziggurats, or these towers, they were used to explain the exploits of Nimrod, who had been deified as a god. And we see another example is the constellation Taurus the bull. According to Ken Fleming, the bull was a symbol of power and strength. And the constellation Taurus speaks of Christ's second coming when he'll come to judge the living and the dead. But in ancient Egypt, Osiris, who is also Nimrod, because what you'll find is the gods in the story of Nimrod goes from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece to Phoenicia and other places around the world after the Tower of Babel incident. But the stories are similar. The stories are the same. So in Egypt, Osiris, who is Nimrod, was depicted as a young bull or calf. And this is the God that the Israelites worshiped when they came out of the land of Egypt. If you remember the story, they made a golden calf and they worshiped it. They were worshiping Osiris. They were worshiping Nimrod. And the whole story of Nimrod and the gods was carried throughout the earth. Now, much more could be said about these things, but these two examples are sufficient to make the point. In fact, I'm still studying these things to see how far this goes and to see how all the constellations work in the idolatrous system, trying to get some background on the Old Testament. But this is sufficient for us to see that Nimrod, who built the Tower of Babel, is deifying himself. And doing so, he corrupted or he created the constellations as part of the idolatrous system of worship in the ancient world. You got to remember that at this time they didn't have writing like we have, and cuneiform hadn't been created yet. And so where they recorded things was in the stars. That's kind of how I understand the history of that time period. But nonetheless, what they recorded was the story of Nimrod, who became a god. And so the building of the Tower of Babel wasn't just the building of a nice tower to protect the people against the rain. It was the establishment, or maybe the reestablishment, of idolatry, which in reality was just the deification of Nimrod. And this is why God intervened. He'd already promised Noah in Genesis chapter 9, verse 11, that he would never again flood the world. And so to stop the spread of evil, he confused the languages and divided the people into different nations. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament alludes to this in Acts 17, 26 and 27, when he says that the Lord did this, that is, separated the nations, which is Babel, so that they should seek the Lord, in hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. In other words, Paul's saying that God divided the people to slow down their rebellion, to give them the optimum chance of seeking his face and finding him and having a relationship with him. If this lesson helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I hope to see you next week, and God bless.